The air in Elias's apartment was thick with the scent of stagnation, a heavy mixture of dust and the metallic tang of old takeout containers. Elias sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, his eyes hollowed out by months of sleeplessness and the rhythmic numbing glow of a smartphone screen. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, paralyzed by the weight of everything he had promised to do but never started. The silence of the room was a constant accusation, a reminder that the world outside was moving forward while he remained anchored in a cycle of self-loathing and delay. A sharp, rhythmic banging at the door shattered the quiet. It wasn't a visitor. No one visited Elias anymore. It was the sound of reality knocking. He stood up, his joints protesting, and found a bright red notice taped to the wood. It was a final demand, a cold ultimatum from a landlord who had run out of patience. His chest tightened as the paper fluttered in his hand. This was the physical manifestation of his decay. He had ignored the emails and the voicemails, but he could not ignore the looming threat of the street. In a frantic, desperate attempt to find something, anything to sell or pawn, he began tearing through a stack of old boxes in the back of his closet. Amidst the forgotten junk of a life half-lived, his fingers brushed against a texture that felt out of place. It was a notebook, bound in worn, cracked leather, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and cedar. This belonged to his late grandfather, a man who had stood like a pillar of strength until his final breath. As Elias wiped the thick layer of dust from the cover, he saw the words etched in a steady, confident hand. The 30-day crucible. It wasn't a diary, it was a manual for a total rebirth. Inside, his late grandfather had detailed a brutal progression of habits designed to strip away the weak parts of a man and forge something unbreakable in their place. With nothing left to lose, Elias decided to begin. Day 1 started at 5:00 a.m. The darkness of the pre-dawn hour felt like a physical weight against his eyelids. Every fiber of his being screamed to stay under the covers, to return to the comfort of the void. His internal saboteur whispered that one more hour of sleep wouldn't hurt, that he wasn't strong enough for this ordeal, yet he forced himself into the biting cold of the morning air. The first 3 days were a blur of physical agony and mental fog. His body ached, and his mind revolted against the absence of the cheap dopamine he usually fed it. Then came the crushing weight of day 4. The momentum he had tried to build shattered against the wall of his own exhaustion. He succumbed to the old addictions, the familiar comforts that had kept him trapped for so long. By sunset, he was surrounded by the very chaos he had tried to flee. He stood before the bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a man who had failed yet again. The despair was a cold, suffocating blanket. He saw the weakness in his own eyes and felt the urge to give up entirely. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The memory of who he used to be began to pulse like a buried heartbeat. He realized that the crucible was not about being perfect, but about the willingness to stand up after falling. He picked up the notebook and read the entry for day 5 with renewed, desperate hunger. He spent the next few days in a state of grim determination, reclaiming his territory from the shadows of his own mind. Just as a small spark of hope began to warm his chest, a heavy, familiar knock echoed through the apartment. He opened the door to find an unexpected figure from his past standing there, a former partner in his worst mistakes. The man's grin was predatory, a ghost of his worst habits, ready to pull him back into the chaos. The man standing in the doorway was a living relic of the life Elias was desperately trying to exhume and burn. He stood there with a practiced, predatory grin, smelling of expensive cologne and the faint, bitter scent of stagnant smoke. This was his former partner in every bad decision he had made over the last decade. A man who thrived on the chaos Elias was currently fighting to escape. He didn't offer a greeting, he offered an out. He spoke of a high-stakes opportunity, a sure thing that could settle Elias's debts in a single night and return him to the comfort of the shadows. Elias felt the familiar, seductive pull of the easy path. It would be so simple to step back into the void, to stop the grueling 5:00 a.m. wake-up calls and the bone-deep exhaustion. But as he looked at the man's restless, darting eyes, Elias saw the reflection of his own former decay. He saw a man who was still a slave to the very things Elias was trying to master. With a voice that felt foreign in its own steadiness, Elias declined. He closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place, feeling like a final verdict on his past life. As the second week groaned into existence, the initial spark of motivation evaporated, replaced by the grueling reality of the Valley of Disappointment. This was the stretch of time his grandfather's journal had warned about, the period between day 8 and day 20, where the novelty of change dies, and the results have yet to manifest in any visible way. It was a monochrome blur of repetition and grit. The cold showers no longer felt like a heroic triumph. They felt like a miserable chore. The meditation felt like an exercise in futility. His mind a swarm of angry bees protesting the sudden lack of digital stimulation. Elias was physically spent, his muscles humming with a constant dull ache, and the mental silence he sought was often filled with the mocking laughter of his former self. To survive this plateau, he leaned harder into the discipline of deep work and a total digital detox. He buried his smartphone in a kitchen drawer for 12 hours a day, a move that felt like losing a limb. Without the constant stream of notifications to numb his underlying anxiety, he was forced to sit in the raw, unfiltered presence of his own thoughts. It was agonizing. His old social circle did not take his absence well. Mocking messages flooded his locked screen, calling him a hermit and a self-help junkie. They tried to pull him back down to the level where they all felt comfortable in their shared stagnation, but Elias stayed the course, his world shrinking down to the four walls of his apartment and the leather-bound manual of his grandfather. By day 16, a profound psychological shift began to take hold. The heavy gray fog that had clouded his brain for years started to thin. It wasn't a sudden explosion of joy, but a gradual sharpening of the world around him. He found himself noticing the intricate patterns of the morning light on his floor, and the way his own breath sounded in a quiet room. More importantly, he began to see professional opportunities that had been hidden in plain sight. He realized that his previous failures weren't due to a lack of talent, but a lack of the mental infrastructure required to sustain meaningful effort. His brain was rewiring itself, trading cheap dopamine for the slow-burning fuel of genuine accomplishment. This newfound clarity was immediately put to the test when a massive financial crisis erupted. A project he had abandoned months ago during a period of deep depression had spiraled into a legal threat. In the past, this would have been the catalyst for a total collapse. He would have ignored the emails until the world ended. Now Elias sat at his desk, his breathing calm and rhythmic. He spent hours dismantling the problem with surgical precision, using the very focus he had been honing in the Crucible. But by day 20, the physical and emotional toll reached a breaking point. He was utterly depleted, standing at a crossroads between a dishonest shortcut offered by his past and the honest, agonizing path of his future. He felt his resolve fracturing until he turned to a page in the notebook he had previously missed. There, he found a hidden passage. His grandfather hadn't written this guide for general self-improvement. He had written it as a path of redemption for a secret family shame that had nearly destroyed them generations ago. The stakes had just shifted from personal growth to the survival of a legacy. The final ascent began not with a roar, but with a profound, resonant silence. By day 21, the resistance that had characterized Elias's every waking moment for years had finally dissolved into the background. The internal saboteur, that mocking voice that had once screamed in protest at every disciplined choice, had been reduced to a faint, powerless whisper. His habits were no longer tasks on a checklist. They had become the very fabric of his identity. He no longer had to wake at dawn or force himself to focus on deep work. He simply did. His body felt lighter, purged of the lethargy of stagnation. His mind, once a cluttered attic of anxieties and half-finished thoughts, was now a streamlined sanctuary of purpose. The momentum of the last 3 weeks had created a psychological gravity that pulled him forward naturally, even when the world outside remained chaotic. This newfound clarity was his greatest weapon during the climax of his professional crisis on day 25. He stood before the people who had held his future in their hands. Individuals who remembered him only as a flake who crumbled under the slightest pressure. But as he spoke, his voice was steady, anchored by the weeks of integrity he had built in private. He didn't offer excuses or pleas for more time. He presented a meticulously crafted strategy to rectify his past mistakes, a plan born from hours of undistracted concentration. He watched the skepticism on their faces transform into a reluctant, then genuine respect. He had reclaimed his reputation not through a single act of heroism, but through 25 days of unseen, relentless discipline. The problem that would have destroyed his old self was dismantled with surgical precision, leaving him standing tall amidst the ruins of his old failures. The man who caught his own reflection in the glass windows of the city was unrecognizable from the shadow who had started this journey. His eyes, once dull and hooded by sleep deprivation and shame, were now sharp, clear, and observant. His apartment, once a tomb of discarded dreams and physical clutter, had become a temple of order and light. The air was no longer heavy with the scent of decay, but carried the crispness of a life being lived with intention. He had learned to value himself because he had finally kept the promises he made to the man in the mirror. He could feel the strength in his limbs, a physical manifestation of the mental fortitude he had cultivated in the early freezing hours of the dawn. His posture reflected a newfound confidence, and the nervous tick in his hands had vanished, replaced by a steady, unwavering calm. On the eve of day 30, the unnamed former partner returned one last time, a ghost of a life Elias no longer recognized. The man stood in the hallway, offering the same hollow promises of quick wealth and easy thrills. He represented the path of least resistance, the gravitational pull of the abyss. Elias looked at him and felt a strange, quiet pity rather than the old fear of being pulled back into the cycle. He didn't need to raise his voice or express anger. He simply stood in his doorway, a physical embodiment of a man who had outgrown his past. When he spoke, it was with a calm indifference that served as an impenetrable shield. He wished the man well and closed the door, not in malice, but as a final closing of a chapter that no longer belonged in his book. The click of the lock was a definitive period at the end of a long, dark sentence. Day 30 was dedicated to the final habit, legacy. Elias realized that the Crucible was never meant to be a purely selfish pursuit. The strength he had forged was meant to be a tool for others. He spent the afternoon at his grandfather's grave, the notebook held tightly in his hands. The wind rustled through the trees as he whispered a thank you to the man who had seen his potential from beyond the grave. He understood now that his grandfather hadn't just given him a set of rules. He had given him a map back to his own humanity. He spent the rest of the day volunteering, sharing the clarity he had gained with those still lost in the fog, using his own scars as a lighthouse for those still drowning in their own procrastination. He realized that true transformation is only complete when it begins to touch the lives of others. As the sun set on the 30th day, Elias sat at his desk, the silence no longer something to be feared, but something to be cherished. The journey had been brutal, a descent into the darkest parts of his soul, followed by a painful crawl